This week in my tour of the National Park Service places, since I talk about him a lot, it's time to visit somewhere that's about Abraham Lincoln. Specifically, the home he made in Illinois. He led a peripatetic life in his childhood as his father moved the family around, and in his young manhood, Lincoln sought to establish himself as a lawyer and a politician after taking several fairly typical frontier-type jobs. Please note, despite the very fun book, ignore the movie, he was never a vampire hunter. But he did live and remodel a rather substantial home in Springfield, Illinois. While he grew up, he was working on the marginal farms his father cut out of the woods, but by the time he was married and a father himself, as well as an emerging lawyer, he was up to purchasing a house in town. The house as it stands today was not the house he purchased. Then as now, the house was remodeled to fit the changing needs of a growing family. Also, as a lawyer, he was part of a town economy that consumed already harvested produce and butchered meats from a market. Much of the farm work and early-stage food processing was now at arm's length, and further from him and his family than it had been for him growing up. It's an interesting house to look at as it exists before electricity and even indoor plumbing. The decor reflects the early years of the industrialization of decorative elements in home furnishing. So some things, especially the furniture, looks like it's from an older age, while the textiles and wallpaper are more flamboyant. As a pre-electricity home, it's interesting to think about the role and placement of fire in the home, for seeing at night, for heat, and for cooking. Preservation of these places that show how a life was lived in a particular place and time can help us see how the world looked when innovations were arriving, and what was exciting and what was still yet to come. The National Park Service has several examples of this sort of time capsule that gives you a window on how people lived, how their experiences were framed by the things they did and did not have. This mid-19th century home of a prosperous lawyer certainly says things about Lincoln's and Mary Todd's tastes, but it also says many more things about the world at that time. So if you can, find a way to visit this or other time capsule dwellings under the aegis of the National Park Service to get a window on daily life, and do a little time travel of your own. And thank the National Park Service for keeping these places alive. Episode 167, The American Civil War, Thanksgiving, and Eating Our Feelings. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how Thanksgiving became a national holiday and how the Civil War made that happen. I'll explain about a woman who waged a decades-long writing campaign and what exactly you ship to a soldier when you want him to have a proper holiday meal in the middle of a war. I'll also finally get to Abraham Lincoln and what his role in the whole thing was. To hear all about this, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that prior to the Civil War, Thanksgiving was as tied to Christian religious ceremonies as it was to food. After the Civil War, the country really leaned into the food. I should say up front, writing about historical wars, when the U.S. is doing a war that's like not a war, is a weird thing. And I completely admit that it has caused me to veer in odd directions at times. It is pulling my focus, but here we are. American Thanksgiving has always been linked to the Puritan landing in Massachusetts and their extremely lopsided interactions with the locals they found there. But the date, the last Thursday in November, links back to George Washington declaring a day of Thanksgiving for the adoption of a new government in 1789. The Constitution was ratified and we were a nation. Sure, the 4th of July is fun and the start of things. And starting a war is flashy and attention-getting, but winning and then getting a government together and getting everyone to play nice, that's much harder. For pulling something off kind of like that, November 26, 1789 was proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving. For years after that, Thanksgiving was sort of a harvest festival largely celebrated in New England with prayer, sometimes fasting depending on your lights, and then feasting. From the start, Thanksgiving food was what was available. And to be fair, there was a lot available at that time of the year. It was the perfect time. It was at the end of harvest when all the local wild animals were fattening up to deal with the coming winter. The homecoming aspect also had to do with the season, since so far the main job of everyone in America, if not the world, was making food. One major occupation for men especially was to work as traveling harvest workers. It was typical to move crop to crop and field to field as a group through the season as wheat, rye, barley, and corn each ripened. People would also travel to shear sheep, slaughter animals, set feeds to fallow, or plant winter wheat, and do any manner of end-of-the-crop year work. When it was all done, everyone could work their way back home to their home farms, hunker down with their barrels of apples, stacked pumpkins, cellared potatoes, onions, salt pork, and winter beer and cider, and then spend a whole bunch of time chopping wood for the cold, dark days to come. Looking back from here, there are many people who look at this and think of these as idyllic times of wholesome fun and rewarding hard work. And there was that, but it was also a time of living on the edge. If you were living and working on your own farm, and most people were, the edge you could fall off of was extremely visible, often so close that seasonal starvation was the norm. The sight of it was a motivation to do the farm work, and plenty of people who did the work were still wiped out, and so ended up doing things like going to war, going to sea, or moving to the city to try to make a way for themselves there. Which brings us back to seeing the harvest as a reason to celebrate, and the push to create Thanksgiving as a national holiday. There were plenty of people who saw it as a good thing, but there was one woman in particular who saw it as a way to pull the country together. Sarah Josepha Buell, born in New Hampshire in 1788, 1 year before the first declared U.S. Thanksgiving, grew up steeped in the ideals of harvest, prayer, and feasting as a celebration of work. Raised around Puritan traditions, she was extremely literate for a woman of her place and time, and she was surrounded by the driven work ethic, the ideal that there was always something more to be accomplished, that one was never done. Sarah followed the path of many ambitious, well-read girls of her age. She founded a school at 18 and taught basic literacy and math to children until she was married. From then on, she was known as Sarah Buell Hale, or more regularly as Sarah Josepha Hale. In that age, marriage meant the end of work outside the home for most women, and definitely the end of a career as a classroom teacher. Homekeeping and expected motherhood did not leave time for teaching, and teaching didn't pay well enough to hire people to keep your home and children for you. So for about 14 years, Hale's world was working as a wife and mother. But she was widowed in 1822 at the age of 34 with 5 children, and her plans of remaining a homemaker were derailed. She started a hat shop, or a millinery shop as it was known then, and that was really a place that sold everything but dresses and undergarments to women. So shoes, hats, gloves, stockings, ribbons, and so on. She didn't prosper in this occupation and turned to private teaching and writing, her true passions. She published both poetry, she wrote the rhyme Mary Had a Little Lamb, as well as novellas. Her first prose book, Northwood, which has 2 subtitles, either Tales of New England or Life North and South, depending on the printing, was a nostalgic retelling of what she saw around her while she was growing up in New Hampshire. Even in the early days of the novel, writing about how lovely things used to be was a popular market. Hale was so enamored with the Thanksgivings of her childhood, she spent an entire chapter writing up what a harvest Thanksgiving meal was. She included the turkey, chicken pies, roast pigeon, pumpkin pies, cranberries, cornbread, gravy sauces, and so on. Her writing caught the attention, or was more likely brought to the attention, of the owner of the Boston Ladies magazine. I mean, that's how things worked in those days. I guess that's how they work in these days, too. Her first year at the magazine, 1827, was also the first time she published an essay calling for Thanksgiving to be made a national holiday. It was also at this point that she began writing letters directly to the sitting president to call for it to become a national holiday. She started with John Quincy Adams and would end up with Lincoln. She would go on to write to Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and finally, Abraham Lincoln. In 1846, she became an editoress, her word, for Godey's Ladies' Book. This was more or less the headwaters of the women's magazine industry in America. Founded in 1830, it began as a subscription pamphlet published once a month, or subscribers could receive bound books containing 6 or 12 months of issues. This periodical contained hand-tinted color illustrations of women's fashions, which now serve as important guides to what women were wearing at different periods of American history. It also included patterns for new dresses, and these patterns would be condensed down to overlapping shapes on 1 or 2 pages. The shapes would then need to be sized up by the home sewers onto spare newsprint and saved paper from other projects. The patterns we can buy now that are already the right size and the pieces are already separated, they're comparatively easy mode. Godey's was notable for also publishing only original American fiction and for copywriting it. Thus, it gave a platform for any American 19th century author you've ever heard of. Poe, Hawthorne, Irving, Beecher Stowe. Sheet music for new songs was also included. It was a way to make songs popular before there was radio. It also included hairdressing tips, bonnet decorating ideas. SJH's millinery experience wasn't all for nothing. Poetry, travelogues, and descriptions of places most people would never go appeared. The book also included art lessons, embroidery patterns, and ideas for needlepoint lettering. Though aimed at women, it was read by both men and women. I can hear it right now. Oh, I only read my wife's magazine for the fiction. Hale also published several issues where only the work of women was included. Her own experience as a woman suddenly widowed and facing the question of her livelihood caused her to write and solicit articles on women's education and the employment of women. She even addressed the issue of equal pay for women and brought up the idea of voting rights for women. Women being able to find employment, especially after marriage and as widows, was a pressing issue that was largely nationally ignored. For when men lost wives, often to childbirth, it was considered normal for him to find a new wife. In fact, it was somewhat common for the children of the first wife to be spread out to live with relatives or simply abandoned as orphans. But it was rare for women with children to be able to remarry, especially for someone in Hale's place who was over 30 with 5 children. It was a similar experience to what Bickerdike from the last episode faced. She was also in her 30s with 3 children. If she hadn't found a place for herself, she and her children would have likely starved. Bickerdike, like many of her sisters, went into nursing and had to find care for her children away from her work. She lived in one place nursing, and her children lived in boarding houses without her. Hale understood that she was fortunate. She had employment that allowed her to maintain a home with her children and hire care for them. All this is to say, by the time the Civil War arrives in America, Sarah Josepha Hale and Godey's Ladies' Book were forces with national clout. They had the largest circulation of any subscription periodical in the country. Today, especially for something that was so ubiquitous, these magazines are somewhat rare. This is due to the fact that each issue was consumed, passed on, and around until many of them disintegrated. In fact, there is many a soldier at forts and this war who spent his time reading found and foraged issues of Godey's Ladies' Book, reading the stories, perusing the literary notices, gawking at the fashion plates, and reading the recipes for yet another holiday feast they would miss. Which brings us back to the campaign to make Thanksgiving a nationally recognized day. Now, at the time, there were few major days that were recognized throughout the country. There was New Year's Day, 4th of July, Christmas. 2 were international events, give or take, and the 4th of July was the beginning of a war. At the start of her crusade, and the religious undertones of her effort make that the correct word, Hale was worried that the country was expanding too fast to retain its original character, or what she saw as the original character, as a daughter of New Hampshire. She saw this as a way to rally around Christian values at a time of year when everyone was doing the same thing. The term Thanksgiving is a form of Christian ceremony. The terminology is used as an introduction to prayer, as in, let us give thanks. And it comes from these root ideas. The most pedantic of the "What's the first Thanksgiving" crowd does in fact point out that the first Thanksgiving in America was actually performed by Spanish priests in what would become Georgia in the 1500s. That's where Ponce de Leon, the Fountain of Youth guy, landed and started his expedition into Florida. We Americans often forget the fact that the Spanish and French were running all over North America before the English got in there. I mean, the Spanish speakers didn't invade us. We invaded them. I mean, look at all of the place names. But Hale's early work on spreading Thanksgiving is really about creating an American religious holiday to bring all Americans together. What is so interesting about that is while she used her bully pulpit at Godey's Ladies' Book to promote her religious cause, she truly gained her fame as a patron and promoter of secular American style. She helped create a way to read American fiction, learn American music, and spread and share American fashion to Americans as they burst away from the original 13 colonies, clinging to the edge of the Atlantic coast. I mean, even the drawing lessons included in the art section called the Family Drawing Master. While there were hints of European styles of architecture in there, the wide boards of new American buildings, American chimney shapes, and the raw board fences going up in new American settlements taught budding artists the shapes of American landscapes. While she was trying to do one thing, she was creating something else uniquely American. So why was she unanswered for 36 years by American presidents? Likely, they had more important things to do. National unity lay in other crises, and several of the presidents she addressed wouldn't have touched a religious topic if they'd been bribed in 21st century money. But if all those other presidents had no interest in this national Thanksgiving thing, why did Lincoln take it up, and why did it work? Well, as I said, the idea of Thanksgiving as a harvest festival had long been popular in New England, and the majority of colonizers and immigrants setting up farms in young America had come from European societies that already had some sort of tradition of harvest festivals. Really, most people were already doing some sort of harvest festival Thanksgiving already. The making it American part came in with what American groceries were available. Way back in Season 2, Episode 85, I talk about the disdain early Americans had and continued to carry for foraging. When you moved to America, all of a sudden it felt like the plants you could eat, and most people were mostly eating plants most of the time at this point, were so very limited. While the foraging menu of the old world was known to their locals, and foraging was a huge part of deciding what was for dinner in Europe, Americans had killed off and chased away the North American locals, who knew their local foraging menu. So we had no extensive menu of what was available outside the farm. Sure, there were the big three, the already cultivated and tamed pumpkins, corns, and beans, obvious stuff like berries, but all the wild herbs, tubers, greens, and roots, the majority of those were lost. America had to farm with what had been brought from the old country and would survive well here. And the few obvious things we found in this new one. We had really boxed ourselves into this farm life. Now, funny aside, while we did figure out that we could eat sunflower roots, what are generally known as sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes, we are only now as a nation collectively learning that you can roast and eat unripe sunflower heads like green corn from Ukrainian cookbooks in the internet age. Anyway, we had hemmed ourselves in by limiting our knowledge about what native crops were available to us. So for the most part, the farm harvest is how we lived, how we survived. Now, we still did a fair amount of hunting to supplement our farm food, but plant foraging was generally very low. So as a country, we were very tied to the harvest of the farm, and up until now, As precarious as our farming strategy might have seemed in the days of pre-mechanical farming, it had never really been endangered by a war. As of now, there are only 17 years in 249 that the U.S. has not been involved in an armed conflict with another nation. Back where I'm talking about now, there had been 3 periods since victory over the British and our emergence as a nation. The first was from 1796 to 1797. There was another from 1807 to 1809, and a third from 1828 to 1830. So we're up to 5 whole years of peace. But up to this point, war was small and abroad, or it meant expanding our land, farmland particularly. The War of 1812 and associated skirmishes had largely taken place in the borderlands and in the woods. We'd taken over the hunting and farming fields of indigenous Americans. We'd done some naval adventuring in the Mediterranean, some incursions into Mexico, as we'd made more United States and less Mexico. We engaged in sloppy amphibious nonsense in the Caribbean as we started to flex at the creaking Spanish Empire. None of this had threatened our farmlands. Sure, the War for Independence had been a war that trashed some farms, but if you remember the numbers I shared at the beginning of the seasons, all things considered, the war was pretty small. But this was a big war, and the American citizenry was being affected. Now, the greatest effect wasn't actually the trashed farmland. Only so many battles could take place, even if it did run for 4 years. The largest impact was the number of men who were pulled away from farm work. In the middle of the 19th century, America is living in a system where 90% of the people live in rural areas and 70% of the population are directly engaged in the endeavor of making food. So pulling 10% of the population into the fighting is going to make a dent, especially when that 10% skews heavily into the people who are doing much of the day-to-day work to grow food. I mean, everyone pitches in at harvest time. There's a mistaken thought that the relocation of the enslaved population would have put the southern states in more of a famine state than the Union, but that was not true. The majority of the enslaved population in the Southeast was actually engaged in producing cash crops and their own food. The southern states typically grew most of their food on small farms and then imported quite a bit of beef and pork on the hoof. So the departure of the enslaved actually did not particularly impact food production. As in any war, the poorer population was drafted and volunteered for the army first. As these were many of the people hired in for seasonal harvest labor, that was the first hit American farm production saw. It was the drafting of men from small farms that really hit the food economy, and then the war also hampered the import economy. Now, in the first year, people had some time to prepare. The war began in April, so they had all summer to get ready for a harvest short on labor. Many people figured that the war wouldn't last through the winter, so spring planting would be back to normal. Not so. The second year, 1862, made people realize that this was going to be hard. But again, the war was still smaller. Recruiting was concentrated on the East Coast, and the newly created farmland to the west, connected with the newly laid railroads, could keep the food flowing in the Union. But by 1863, with another year of short labor in the planting season and at harvest, along with ever-increasing additions to the army, even less labor was available on farms, which meant food shortages were really starting to hit Americans. Sarah Josepha Hale may have pushed Thanksgiving as a day of Christian unity through prayer, and even the year before the war started as a way to prevent war. But when Lincoln received her regular letter to the president, he saw the fact that unity through food and the need to preserve and rebuild food production and distribution is what would truly hold the country together. Starting in the post-harvest season of 1862, the idea of providing a Thanksgiving meal to Union soldiers was an idea Hale promoted and many people got behind. The same mobilization that was behind the potato fleet was also poured into providing holiday food for the troops. However, this food was being sent by people who had no access to or even thoughts of chemical or mechanical refrigeration. So this limited both what could be sent and the timing of when people thought it would work to send things. First, obviously, it had to happen after harvest. Plus, enough time had to pass to gather the food to depots where it could be collected and sorted to be sent, where Thanksgiving food could be processed and distributed to soldiers. And finally, there was the calculation in letting the weather get cold enough so that meat in forms other than salted could be shipped. Granted, in this day and age, the preferred way to transport non-salted meat was on the hoof, but train cars full of live turkeys was not in the cards. Feeding them all, herding them all, hoping that train transport maddened turkeys wouldn't just all murder each other. The mortality of crowded, scared avians is a real and frightening thing. And even if the turkeys did get there alive, there's the killing, butchering, plucking, and dressing of turkeys to get them ready for cooking. That is a particular set of skills. I mean, not hard once you learn them, but as we already know, most soldiers can barely cook. Getting a turkey ready for the spit would be far beyond most of them. To this end, wrangling goodies from people and getting them to transports in the third week of November meant that Thanksgiving goodies could be got to the soldiers for the fourth Thursday or thereabouts. The type of food that is sent for such a mission contains lots of fruit, apples especially, as they would have just been harvested everywhere and they travel relatively well. Potatoes, onions, and turnips, along with butter, would have filled out the rest of the vegetable complement. Extremely popular with everyone, from the organizers and transporters to the soldiers, were the puddings and crust-enclosed pies. While they wouldn't stand up to our modern rigorous food safety standards, an enclosed pie that allowed limited air contact to food surfaces, that was traveling in weather that hovered in the low 50s or below, that's 10°C for the rest of the world, was a good way to move prepared food. Sweet pies like apple pies, pumpkin pies, plum puddings, peach pies, and mincemeat, if they had dry enough fillings, would be sound upon arrival. And yes, in this age, mincemeat pies still generally contained meat and large amounts of suet, or fats. This actually aided in them keeping longer. Savory pies, particularly chicken and game pies, were also a huge favorite. These were one of the things that were ready to eat upon arrival. They were either sweet or contained more seasonings and spices than most of the soldiers had experienced their entire time on campaign. Dressed turkeys, that is, butchered with the non-edible parts removed, were shipped in the cold weather to be roasted in camp fire pits, though from some letters it seems that cooked turkeys were shipped as well. And the other somewhat luxury food that shipped well, especially in the cold weather, oysters. Most of the oysters would have been eaten cooked. Eating them raw seems to be like a seaside and city approach. But since oysters come in their own cooking vessel, when oyster stew wasn't available, they were also a popular item and mentioned often in letters home. Oyster stew was very commonly mentioned. It wasn't just oysters cooked in their shells on the coals. It is interesting that there are few mentions of ham, sausage, or other pork products. At this point, I can think of 3 reasons why these would not be included in the Thanksgiving goodies or merit mention by the soldiers to whom they were sent. First, pig butchering time usually takes place later in the year when it's even colder. This is because pigs are easy to feed as the livestock has to come indoors. So pigs are typically slaughtered after any extra cows. Note, if you will, that summer sausage, that is sausages made in the summer from excess male animals, is made with beef, not pork. Second, smoked pork in sausage and ham and bacon form is an important way to make it through the winter, especially in a country that was suffering salt shortages. So while people might send on cows and turkeys and chicken pie, they needed to keep the pork at home to make it through the winter themselves. Third, pork was already so much a part of the military diet for both sides that sending hams or sausage or bacon was not considered a treat for the troops. When soldiers were eating meat, they were eating pork most of the time anyway, so people were not asked to send ham or home-cured pork. As for drink, this was one of the times when alcohol was issued by the military to the troops. Beer and cider, of course, but from letters there seems to have been the distribution of wine and champagne as well. If you were an officer with rich relatives and connections in the right places, that champagne might actually have been French. But for an enlisted man who saw sparkling wine, it was almost certainly from upstate New York. Hold on to your fur-edged and feather-trimmed hats. The rise of New York wine is going to be its own topic next season. Since SJH had been on this campaign about making Thanksgiving a national holiday for 35 years by 1862, she had gathered considerable clout as the editoress at Godey's Lady's Book, and the campaign to provide the soldiers had been such a feel-good success in 1862 when her personal letter landed on his desk in October of 1863, and it was very clear that the war wasn't about to end by Christmas of that year, Lincoln went ahead and became the second president to declare a national day of Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday of November. It wasn't a particularly hard lift. At this point, the governors of 30 states and 3 territories were already acknowledging Thanksgiving as an American celebration, though on different days throughout the month. Choosing the fourth Thursday in November had several practical reasons behind it. It was well after the harvest, so everyone could get back home from all their employment around the countryside, working harvests on other farms. Most of the food processing and storage tasks had been taken care of as well, so everyone could relax a bit and hunker down for the winter. Also, importantly, malaria and fever seasons had passed, especially in the southeast. At this point in America, mosquitoes were major disease vectors. They have been particularly deadly in war. I mean, heck, they helped win the Revolutionary War. And when you have large concentrations of people and tend to accumulate stagnant water, well, there were 1,300,000 reported cases of malaria and 10,000 reported deaths from it in the Civil War. But as weather cooled down and mosquito populations went dormant for the winter, the malarial and yellow fever waves passed. So this was a period of calm in both seasonal farm tasks and seasonal disease waves. And of course, there's also the fact that George Washington had chosen that day to celebrate the ratification of the Constitution and the formation of the nation's new government. In Lincoln's declaration, he acknowledged the religious elements of celebration, but he focused on 2 other themes that he saw as essential for the survival of the country. Hale may have seen this as primarily a way to promote and strengthen Christian identity, but Lincoln had bigger ideas. In his address, he acknowledges the gifts of the Most High God, but also points out that God's kind of disappointed in his children for fighting in such a destructive manner, yet still bestows his mercy. The concentration of Lincoln's proclamation was on harvest and health. He focuses on the fact that large portions of the nation's harvest have had to go into the war, and this is a waste of the efforts of its citizens. We really could be doing better things with our time than trying to tear the nation asunder. But to me, the most profound thing, the sentiment he ends the proclamation with, is the recognition of loss and suffering with a call for restoration and resolution. And I recommend to them that while offering up the ascriptions justly due to him for such singular deliverances and blessings, they do also with humble penitence for our national perverseness and disobedience, commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife in which we are unavoidably engaged, and fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation, and to restore it as soon as may be consistent with divine purposes, to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union. I have a link in the show notes of the entire text if you're curious. I mean, the man understood how to be pithy yet profound. The whole thing comes in just under a page. Lincoln would deliver another proclamation in 1864 to the same purpose. That would be his last one since he would be dead in April of 1865, just days after the surrender of the Confederacy. The United States and its precursors had a habit of using Thanksgiving for some wild publicity stunts. But all the same, Lincoln's declared call for healing and recognizing of suffering says something about the way he thought about war. There are some other interesting things to note about Lincoln's declaration. First, it was for a single day to be a national day of Thanksgiving. He did give it his blessing, but did not make it permanent. That would have to wait for a declaration by Roosevelt during the Second World War. Roosevelt would place 8 permanent national holidays into the American calendar at the same time. While Lincoln's declaration fixed the day in the calendar for much of the nation, it also meant that for many people in the defeated Confederacy, they would purposefully celebrate their harvest Thanksgiving on a different day, or maybe not celebrate the day at all, or spend the day cursing Lincoln's name, which meant that Black Southern food traditions were established earlier and held more sway on Southeastern Thanksgiving tables. 1863, incidentally, was also the year of the first recorded presidential pardon of a turkey. However, it was a turkey slated for the Christmas table. Lincoln's youngest son, Tad, had become fond of the turkey, and as another son, Willie, had died just the previous year, profoundly marking all family members, Lincoln allowed Tad to keep his turkey pal for a while longer. Do please note, 3 of the 4 Lincoln children died before adulthood. 1 of tuberculosis, 1 of typhoid fever, and 1 from a bad bruise. In this age before vaccinations and antibiotics, even the most powerful man in the country was as much at the mercy of injury and disease as a poor farmer. The Civil War came at the front of a wave of big changes in the scientific and medical communities in Europe and America. Germ theory was in the process of being comprehensively understood, and a huge fight about how people got sick and how they could be cured and how disease could be prevented was right on the horizon. But before we get there, America is going to experience its first opioid epidemic, and its start is in the Civil War. But there's more to it than that. The drug wars inside the American Civil War are going to have global effects. To hear all about that, tune in next week. And thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your much appreciated reviews on your pod listener of choice. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOAFood. And all this information is available in the show description. And sorry that these 2 episodes have been so late between visitors and then being ill. My weekend writing schedule has been badly beaten up, but I should be back on track coming up next week. I already have a title for that one. Thanks for your patience.